In lecturing on the meaning and evolution of Greek drama, it is only appropriate that we begin with Aeschylus. Aeschylus is considered the greatest of the Greek playwrights. His Oresteia remains one of the few tripartite classics of Western literature, a play in its threefold movement, serving as a window into the progression and development of antique literature and consciousness. The great classicist C.J. Harrington argued that the Oresteia includes, quote, a gradual climb from torment through testing into the light, end quote. Why is Aeschylus the epitome of the Greek playwright tradition? After all, he was the first of the grand four playwrights that we remember and that many people read over the course of a classical education, which would include Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes. And why, then, is Aeschylus so important? On one hand, Aeschylus is great because his work is the manifestation of a long literary philosophical tradition that was wrestling with the cosmogonic idea of strife in the poets who preceded him, especially Hesiod and Homer, who we will briefly touch on soon. On another hand, it is because his works represent the ideal movement of humanity from strife, rage, and hate to justice, love, and persuasion, which is the very spirit of civilization after all these millennia. Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad are very important to understand before we continue further in understanding Aeschylus. Hesiod's Theogony is a sublimely violent poem where the muses sing praises to the gods who engage in patricide and usurpation. The gods, which were conceived in lust and hatred, have nothing but lust and hatred toward their fathers, Uranus among the Titans and Kronos among the Olympians. Kronos castrates Uranus, and his blood and phallus fall to the earth and sea, giving rise to monsters and birthing Aphrodite from the open womb of Thalassa, the primordial goddess of the sea. Strife reigns supreme in Hesiod's grand epic, and is that which the muses sing in praise of. Kronos overthrows Uranus, takes his place as the chief god, who is then overthrown by Zeus and the Olympians. Giambattista Vico, an important 17th and early 18th century Italian philosopher and literary theorist, argued that sublime poetry is the first and primitive instantiation of rationality in human life. While Homer may have composed his grand epics before Hesiod or around the same time, it is without question, following Vico, that Hesiod's cosmos is in fact the older one. Homer's cosmos, while retaining much of the strife of Hesiod, is radically subversive. In this respect, Homer was the radical, altering the Greek understanding of the cosmos, while Hesiod was the reactionary, trying to preserve, if not otherwise return, to the more ancient cosmos of strife, blood, and guts. Homer's Iliad is a majestic epic of love, not war, when you read it closely. Whereas Hesiod's muses sing of tyrannical gods, Homer's muses sing of a rage-filled man in faraway Ilium, who, over the course of the epic, learns something new about the meaning of life through the ingenious pen of Homer. Achilles is initially moved by his passions, but, by the epic's end, comes to learn love by ordering his passions to something new and grander than the rage which had consumed him for much of the poem. The defining image of Homer's Iliad is the shield he receives after the death of Patroclus. The shield that Achilles receives after the death of Patroclus reveals the enduring imagery and the ideas that are contained in Homer's Iliad. The shield is emblazoned with two images, a seemingly peaceful city celebrating a wedding day, which upon closer inspection is filled with a lot of strife. Surrounding that first image is the second image of a city at war. Though strife is more apparent in the second image, it is readily visible because we can tell that it's a city at war. The strife experience from war has led all persons, young and old, male and female, soldier and non-combatant, to be focused. In strife, Homer subtly informs us, there is the possibility of ordering our strife-filled passions to something good, something beautiful, something productive. And this is, of course, what Achilles learns by the end of the poem. When rage-filled Achilles goes on his killing spree after the death of Patroclus, he slaughters the sons of Priam with his culling hand and spear. Lycoon, one of Priam's sons, throws himself shamelessly at the feet of Achilles and begs for his life. Achilles refuses to show pity and mercilessly cuts open his bowels as his intestines spill out onto the sand and the feet of the great warrior. Then, of course, Achilles challenges Hector. They have their duel, and after slaying Hector, he attempts to defile his body, but the gods prevent Hector's bodily destruction. In that most remarkable conclusion of Homer, Priam enters the tent of Achilles and throws himself at the feet of the great warrior, just as his son Lycoon had done. Homer inverts the image and the outcome in this recapitulation of images. Rather than brutally cut down Priam, as he did Priam's sons, even though Achilles has just declared that he wishes to destroy and wipe out Priam's seed from the face of the earth, Achilles learns to love and then weeps with the king of Troy. They shed tears together. Homer takes the strife-filled cosmos of Hesiod and his predecessors and turns it on its head by arguing that the cosmos is filled with strife and also love, and that love may heal the strife-filled cosmos, even if for only a brief moment in time, and that is what we should be directing our hearts and souls to. That is why Homer's Iliad ends so fittingly, even though we know, as Homer's audience knew, that Troy is still to be sacked and Achilles to be killed. Yet that is not how the Iliad ends. It is in this poetic cosmos that Aeschylus enters. The Oresteia includes the conclusion of another one of the great warriors of the Trojan War, Agamemnon. It is the conclusion of Agamemnon's life. The first play in his trilogy opens with a lookout guard, restless, as if in prison, because of his duties and the restlessness that he feels. He is completely on edge and disordered. Though he looks up upon the stars he knows by heart, the starry skies cannot guide him to the gods because he is an imprisoned watcher, and his disquietude sets the ominous stage for the rest of the play. As the Oresteia opens, it is open alone. There is a great loneliness and an ominous foreboding spirit that is governing it. We quickly learn that Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's unfaithful wife, is conspiring with Aeschylus to kill her husband as an act of revenge for killing their daughter, Iphigenia, and for leaving her to be alone and worried for 10 years. She feels betrayed by Agamemnon, and at least in the beginning of the Oresteia, she has a certain sympathetic aura around her. Agamemnon's love for her was less than his lust for power. As such, the world of Agamemnon is one that is restless, cold, and as if a prison cell of torment. The chorus hauntingly chants on the eve of Agamemnon's murder those famous lines that ring true then as now. The lust for power never dies. Men cannot have enough. The play ends in murder. It concludes with Clytemnestra recapitulating the old cosmogonic world of strife and power as she stands over the dead bodies of Agamemnon and Cassandra, whom she cut down in cold blood, as she then declares, "Our lives are based on pain. You and I have power now," speaking to her lover. "We will set the house in order once and for all." Order, as we begin to see, in this bleak and ancient outlook, is brought about by power, and not love or persuasion, at least not in the first movement of Aeschylus's trilogy. But this is not where the Oresteia arc ends. It continues. The libation bearers opens not with a restless imprisonment, but with a prayer to the gods and a plea for salvation. The opening sets the tone for the rest of the movement, and the second act of the trilogy captures Orestes in pain and needing purgation, but also his dependence on the gods, who were largely absent in the brutal world of politicking and murder and scheming in the first part of the Oresteia. It is true that Orestes will murder his mother as well as Aeschylus, thus standing over their dead bodies just as Clytemnestra had done standing over the murdered bodies of Agamemnon and Cassandra. But where Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon and Cassandra out of hatred and spite, Orestes kills his mother and scheming lover out of devotion to his father and to the gods, or so he claims. And this is going to be quite important as we move to the third and final play of the trilogy, the Eumenides. Orestes is haunted by Clytemnestra's furies, which hound him into exile and pursue him to Apollo's temple because of the murder of his mother. But before those haunting images of a man pursued by the furies of conscience commences and dwells in us, Pythia opens the third act by discussing piety, destiny, and free will. We see in this the movement away from the purely poetic world of passion and how it has now transfigured itself into the world of rational inquiry. We are now beginning to discuss philosophical concepts, piety, destiny, and free will, as well as the importance of love and the family. Again, the opening of the play sets the tone and themes for the rest of the play, and the third play opens with the most optimistic imagery and language, even though we all know and remember principally that great imagery of Orestes haunted by the Furies. The Furies are not just the spirits of Clytemnestra, they are the link between the dead and the living. The Furies act as intermediaries of sorts between the realm of the breathless dead and the pulsating living. That the Furies hound Orestes also signifies that they are more than just Clytemnestra's ghosts. They are the psyche of Orestes, who is haunted over his deed. They represent guilt. The Furies are the unconscious moral law written on the hearts of humans, which remind us of our misdeeds and gross violations through the reality of guilt. The Furies are awakened by Clytemnestra's wrath and pursue Orestes to Athena and Apollo, straight to the gods of reason and justice, incidentally, where we are going to begin the rational discourse on the nature of justice. Again, a philosophical concept. It is the court case before Athena and Apollo, which is the enduring achievement of Aeschylus in the Oresteia. The Furies demand justice for the murder. Orestes appeals that he had done what he had done because it was the command of Apollo and because he had loved his father. Orestes is saying that his actions were rational and therefore just and loving. No wife, and certainly no mother, would ever do what Clytemnestra had done, or so Orestes appeals. The showdown pits instinct and persuasion against reason and persuasion. What are we going to find more persuasive, instinct or reason? That supposedly high and noble ideal that finally enters Greek literature through the pen of Aeschylus and then down into the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. What is the difference between instinct and reason, and where does persuasion factor into this dialectic? Athena says to the leader of the Furies, "But if you have any reverence for persuasion, the majesty of persuasion, the spell of my voice that would appease your fury, oh, please stay." The Furies are not simply brushed aside and pushed away and mocked away. They are invited to stay and give their account. The Furies cry out for justice in the form of revenge, which would just continue the lustful and bloody cycle of death. Athena convinces the Furies that she has not supplanted their authority or prestige. On the contrary, she makes them realize that what they desire, their instinct, justice, is something good and indeed rational. The manner, however, in which they sought to manifest justice was problematic. The Furies cry and wail at first, but suddenly join with Athena. Love conquers hate and brings healing. Give joy in return for joy, one common will for love, and hate with one strong heart. Such union heals thousands of ills of men, the Furies chant, after being persuaded by Athena and receiving a name change, a sort of baptism to represent them as a new creation. So the Furies sing with Athena at the trilogy's end. Cry, cry in triumph, carry on the dancing on and on. This peace between Athena's people and their guests must never die. All seeing Zeus and fate embrace, down they come to urge our union on. Cry in triumph, carry on the dancing on and on. Aeschylus's cosmos is not without bloodshed, violence, or torment. As we know from reading the Oresteia, it is filled with bloodshed, violence, and torment. He has not completely shed the reality of patricide, filicide, and the bloodlust which characterize the Hesiotic cosmos. Nor is Aeschylus's cosmos the first instantiation of love penetrating the dark and fatalistic abyss of struggle. As simply stated in our beginning, we find that in Homer. But Aeschylus's cosmos goes beyond Homer's in presenting reason and persuasion as an integral aspect of the cosmos that was otherwise absent in Homer. Furthermore, the house of Atreus, which represents humanity as a whole, also goes through a metamorphosis over the course of the trilogy. The human actors were imprisoned, restless, and lustful. In the beginning, Agamemnon. The human actors are moved to passion and force in the libation bearers, as the end of their restless lust displayed in the previous play. The human actors are finally then moved to reason, persuasion, and justice when it comes to the Eumenides, as Aeschylus completes the threefold movement from restless lust to persuasive justice, and the missing fourth part of the play would have continued us further into the realm of metaphysical peace, the union of the gods and men in this life. It is through struggle and conflict with flesh and blood, and with conscience, that causes the great leap forward, according to Aeschylus. And wrestling in the muck, mud, and blood, we do not simply remain there. We lift ourselves out of it. We proceed from restless passion to directed rage, and finally to ordered reason. And the birth of civilization is premised on persuasion, love, and justice. The Oresteia is a window into the sad and sorry trials and experiences that pushed Orestes, i.e. humanity, to seek persuasion, justice, and the joy that we seek is found in persuasion and justice. We can also see Aeschylus here building upon and continuing that tradition found in Homer, where Homer took the rage of Achilles and turned it into a forgiving love. That is something Aeschylus also does, but he doesn't leave us in the world of mere passion. There must be a reason, a persuasion, a rationality to the passions we have. When Athena was able to get the Furies to be persuaded to her point of view, she pointed out that their instinct, their desire for revenge was in fact, at least partially, a desire for something good, justice. And it was her explaining what justice was to the Furies that transformed them from rage-filled, vengeful entities into creatures born anew, singing and dancing in the world of civilization. Was the union of love and persuasion, as entailed by Aeschylus, really the gateway to the eradication of love in the name of persuasion, as Euripides would go on to say? We'll explore that in a bit. Were the Furies in the right and Athena in the wrong all along, as Euripides also entails in his cynical and often brutal depiction of the gods in his plays? And we're going to get to that in a bit. Can love and persuasion coexist? Are we doomed to fatalistic strife? All of these questions, these philosophical questions, are born in Aeschylus's Oresteia. Aeschylus is essential for anyone wrestling with these questions, as well as being a prophet in the darkness, or a demon masquerading as an angel of light, depending on how one peers into the sacristy of the Greek gods, wrestled with by men like Hesiod and Homer, who we've also already explained, as well as to Sophocles, Euripides, who we are going to explain in this lecture, alongside the philosophers like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and even among the Christians, St. Paul and St. Cyprian and St. Augustine, among many others. For us, however, Aeschylus's cosmos is one where love and persuasion, order and freedom, justice and punishment are all tied together. The world that we often strive to achieve is the same world that Aeschylus hoped to achieve more than 2.5 millennia ago. As such, Aeschylus remains the enduring playwright, the greatest of the playwrights, perhaps laughing at us or weeping with us in our own struggle, like the Furies and Orestes, to seek justice, to do justice, and to love without hatred or rage. Isn't this the enduring pursuit of human civilization? That is what Aeschylus is suggesting to us in the Oresteia, and that is why the Oresteia makes him the greatest of the playwrights. Having just examined how justice becomes the central concern of Aeschylus, this question of justice and whether there is a moral and just arc to the cosmos is picked up by Sophocles, the other great playwright in the ancient Greek tradition. Sophocles, who lived from 496 to 406 BC, like his slightly younger contemporary, Euripides, who again we will cover very shortly here, lived in exciting and transformative times. But where Euripides blasphemously ridiculed the gods and showed their callous cruelty, Sophocles, at least among the handful of plays that have survived, leaves the gods conspicuously absent from his dramas. Instead of the gods being our deliverance, as they were in Aeschylus, the family is the instrument of salvation and the bulwark against tyranny in his surviving plays, but not without harrowing darkness before ascending into the light. Sophocles was closer to Aeschylus than Euripides in his content and message. Like Aeschylus, Sophocles was also more frequently honored at the festivals and playwright competitions than the younger and more impetuous tragedian who exposed the hollowness of the dark sacristy of the Athenian pantheon. This bears out in his plays, in the plays of Sophocles, where love and filial piety, themes that were present in Aeschylus, become the major themes concerning the nature of justice in Sophocles. However, unlike Aeschylus, who located filial piety as contingent with the gods, for example, we have to remember what we just covered. Orestes, in order to defend himself, had to defend himself before the court of Apollo and Athena. Sophocles, by contrast, located the nexus of filial piety purely between humans. Electra's deliverance with the advent of Orestes, or Antigone's heartbreaking devotion to Polynices, which awakens Creon, the ruler of Thebes, to his failures. Even the sympathy the reader has for isolated Philoctetes all point to the importance of family life in providing meaning, comfort, and civilizational stability in Sophocles' works. Beyond filial piety and deliverance, the other great theme that concerned Sophocles was the tyranny of the state. Creon embodies statist tyranny in the play Antigone. Even pitiable Oedipus is the strong man of the state in Oedipus Rex, going as far as boldly eulogizing himself as the ruin who saved the state. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus in Electra are equally statist agents who are interested in the lust for power that characterizes the naked reality of human politics. So when you read Sophocles, he is doing many things. He is dealing with the reality of politics and civilization, the civilization born from the acquittal of Orestes in the Oresteia trilogy from Aeschylus, playing with the same characters and the same stories and changing them dramatically, as he does in Electra. He is also dealing, therefore, with the problem of state tyranny, and what exactly is the best buttress against state tyranny? Is it the gods who are conspicuously absent, or is it the family, the center of our human-to-human devotion, which allows us the power to stand up to the oppression of the state? Athens had slipped from the open democracy that it was when she led the defense of Greece against the Persians. Though the Athenian delegates and Pericles, in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, proclaim in an open-air forum the greatness of Athens, the greatness was waning prior to the war and certainly exacerbated itself during the conflict when Sophocles was composing his late works. So Sophocles lived in the golden age of Athenian democracy, and he also lived during its decline into tyranny, its decline into war. And that is the backdrop to the tragedy of Electra. Even though Electra is set in the Trojan War as one of the late plays of Sophocles, it is dealing with the contextual environment of the Peloponnesian War. Likewise, Philoctetes has the Trojan War as its immediate context, yet that was also written during the final decade of the Peloponnesian War. The loneliness and desolate isolation that Philoctetes embodies is the same loneliness and isolation that drove Clytemnestra to plot to kill Agamemnon. The difference being that Philoctetes was mercilessly abandoned for his, funny enough, smelly foot and left for dead on an island all alone. Philoctetes survived but is taken advantage of by returning Greek heroes, Odysseus in particular. Poor Philoctetes, however, is robbed of a life, of a family, and of the happy ideal of life with others because of what happened to him, having been isolated and left alone on an island as his friends and countrymen fought and died in the Trojan War, with some of the survivors returning home for that happy life with their family, like Odysseus. In this respect, Sophocles is amending the same wisdom imparted to the world from the pen of Homer and Aeschylus. Love, especially as directed to the family or for family, is what makes life worth living in the rage-filled and dark cosmos that the Greeks inhabited. That filial love, however, was rapidly dissipating during the life of Sophocles, and this, mind you, is what would cause Euripides to present love as a dangerous thing. Nevertheless, Sophocles was living through the rise and the decline of filial piety, which corresponded, in his mind, with the rise and the decline of Athens. It would be wrong to maintain that Sophocles, or any of the Greeks for that matter, had an understanding of natural law in the same way that scholastic Christians did. In fact, reading back onto the Greeks, the high moral law is, ironically, part of the Christian inheritance of the Western intellectual tradition. Apart from Aristotle and Cicero, especially the latter, it is hard to ascertain anything resembling St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia and its ruminations on the natural law, which was developed through centuries, almost a millennium, of Catholic thinking and encyclicals. Nevertheless, we do see the faint glimpses of the natural law in Sophocles, which was more fully developed in Sophocles' own plays than even in Aristotle and Cicero. The closest revelation to Sophocles' natural law and the centrality of the family to it comes through the person of Creon, especially as connected through the plays Oedipus Rex and Antigone. Patricide and incest are objects of shame in Oedipus Rex. Such crimes, though Oedipus is fated by the gods to commit such heinous acts, are the focus of scorn from Sophocles' pen. Blinded and ashamed, Oedipus prepares to leave Thebes, but not without talking to Creon one last time. In the final dialogue between Oedipus and Creon, Oedipus implores Creon to nurture Antigone and Ismene and blesses him before his exile. Prior to this touching moment, the closest thing to a resolution in the play, Oedipus was filled with pride and the lust for power. Accompanied by Jocasta, his mother, whom he had taken as his wife, the two coldly assert that to be liberated from one's parents makes one free and happy. Moreover, we are informed that Oedipus's foster father, Polybus, loved him, and loved him ever so dearly. Upon hearing the news of his supposed father's death, Oedipus callously rejoices, which exposes his hollowness. "You were a gift. He took you from my arms," the shepherd messenger tells Oedipus upon delivering the news. "A gift?" Oedipus retorts, "but he loved me as his own." The messenger replies, "He had no children of his own to love." Jocasta, overhearing the conversation, is overcome with guilt and shame, and leaves to commit suicide. Oedipus and Jocasta had mocked the gods and scorned fathers and mothers in the lust for self-power and political gain. Although we know the gods had fated them to misery, one cannot help but feel a certain rage at both in celebrating the death of parents. Their celebratory emptiness was their choosing, Sophocles seems to hint at, which makes their crimes worse than if they had simply played out the lot that fate had dealt them. As such, the family is utterly destroyed, except for Antigone and Ismene, who mature under Creon's watchful and loving arms. However, in Antigone, Creon, suffering from various political challenges, his relationship with Antigone changes for the worse. He condemns Antigone for wanting to bury the body of her treacherous brother. Creon had decreed, civically, by the force and power of the state and its laws, that none of the enemies of Thebes are to be honored, which would include the most important burial rite in ancient Greek society, the right to be buried. Polynices is left on the blood-stained field of battle, his body to be the food of vultures for his rebelliousness against the state. Antigone, by contrast, affirms the law of filial love in wanting to bury the body of her brother. And as mentioned, burial was one of the most important of rites in ancient Greek society. That is also seen when we read Homer's Iliad. Priam going to seek the recovery of the body of Hector so as to bury him. Creon and the loving, not necessarily strong-willed as usually interpreted Antigone, come to crossing blows over how to react to the death of Polynices. Creon has ordered, with the authority of the state and its laws, to let traitors rot, to be consumed by rats and vultures. Antigone, on the other side, exhibits the spirit of love to bury the body of her brother in a dignified grave, dignifying him and carrying herself and her spirit with the dignity of love afforded to a family member. Creon's tyrannical actions sever his bond with Antigone. Ismene's submission to civic tyranny instead of the moral law equally destroys her relationship with her sister. It is not until Antigone and Haemon flee to the culling fields to bury and honor Polynices, thus making themselves enemies of the state in the process, that Creon, in his loneliness, a theme that we should start to see about the nature of tyranny and destruction in the Greek playwright tradition, realizes his errors. He cries out as if to the heavens. In the end, it is the ancient codes, oh my regrets, that one must keep. To value life, then one must value law. Creon's tearful statement is ironic. The law he associates with life is not the civil law he had been forcibly promoting throughout the play, but the moral law of the family, which brings and nurtures life into the world. He rushes to the field, too late. Antigone and Haemon are both dead. Creon realizes his sins and repents, but the tragedy has come full gale, though we have learned something important from Creon's claim that to value life, one must keep those ancient codes of filial piety alive. In the midst of Sophocles' works is the struggle between the family and state, between the liberty and the love of the family and the tyranny and the demagoguery of the state. Aristotle, one of the philosophers who came after the Greek playwright tradition, maintained that family served as the basis of all civilization. Aristotle wasn't on to something new. He was restating something ancient, which had been long forgotten in Athens' descent into imperialism and eventually tyranny. In starting over, Aristotle began again with the basics that we find in the works of Sophocles. The Athens of Sophocles' time was a morally degenerate and anti-filial, anti-family place. We're going to see this more when we look at Euripides and, of course, the great satirist Aristophanes. The place of the family in Athenian life had been dethroned. It had been dethroned by the state. The dissolution of family and the crisis of agnatic relationships are not only visibly presented in the tragedians, they are also the focus of the philosophers. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Plato treats this subject, the dissolution of family bonds and the supremacy of the state, in his dialogues, especially the Euthyphro and the Crito. In calling for a return to the ancient codes that Creon laments, that he cries out at the end of Antigone, Sophocles was advocating a return to the stability and the order and the liberty of the family as the most effective buttress against state power and the chaos unleashed in a society obsessed with self-pursuit and self-power, which ultimately destroyed Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Electra is the great play which showcases the theme of filial deliverance, the continuation of the theme of filial piety and its importance in Sophocles' mind. Electra has been living under the tyranny of her mother, Clytemnestra, and her adulterous lover, Aeschylus. Again, what you see in the Greek playwright tradition is a repeat, a recapitulation, a reuse of the same stories of other playwrights. She is alone and tormented. She loathes her mother for her actions and doesn't consider Clytemnestra, her mother, based upon her actions. Though Clytemnestra gave birth to her, her actions in killing Agamemnon, in murdering Cassandra, in seeking the exile of Orestes, shows that she is no mother. No mother would murder her husband and coldly celebrate the news of the death of her son. Deviating from his great master and teacher, Aeschylus, Sophocles rewrites Electra's deliverance. Aeschylus had Electra meet Orestes at the tomb of Agamemnon in the Libation Bearers. Electra fully knows of Orestes' plan to execute vengeance or justice upon Clytemnestra and Aeschylus. In Sophocles' version, our heart agonizes and weeps with and for Electra. She is abused and distraught when Clytemnestra celebrates the news of the death of Orestes. Electra proclaims that her world, her entire world, has been taken from her and that she has no will left to live. Did the callous woman cry and mourn for her dead son, she asks. Was there an ounce of grief or pain? Not a bit of it. She left us laughing. Oh, my poor dearest Orestes, you have snuffed my life out by your death. Electra bitterly cries upon hearing the news and seeing the callous, cruel response of her mother. Her cries are a testament of her love, a love bound to her brother, the bond of the family. Without family and suffering the burden of tyranny, Electra informs us that life is unbearable. So when you are alone, again that theme of loneliness, when you are alone, when you are without your family, and you have the tyranny of the state, life seems as if it is something that is not worth living. It is ultimately unbearable. This is she, a most unhappy woman, Electra weeps in front of Orestes, not yet knowing that he is still alive. Orestes, in seeing his sister in this state of agony, is moved to pity, a testament of his love for her. You can see here how the bond of love between Electra and Orestes is going to deliver them from the loneliness and the tyranny that they are suffering from. I cannot bear to think of your wretched, unwedded life, he says. In this exchange, Sophocles is telling us that life without a family is miserable, but is also indicating that life with a family is plentiful and joyful. It is the love that a sister has for her brother, the love that a brother has for his sister, and the hope of seeing her married that give them the strength to renew their life and to confront the tyranny of those who oppress them, of their own mother. When Orestes reveals himself to Electra, she is moved to joy and bliss, knowing that her brother is still alive. O day of bliss, she proclaims, pure bliss on bliss indeed, Orestes lovingly answers. Love, family, and deliverance are bound up together in Electra. The love, again, of a brother and a sister, the reunification of a family torn apart by murder, and the lust for power brings about not only earthly deliverance in the form of blissful joy, but also deliverance from the hand of cruel and petty political power. Electra is not a tragedy like Oedipus Rex or Antigone. Electra is a play of deliverance and the triumph of the bonds of love that comes through the tribulations of tragedy. In tragedy, we have the ability to sympathize, empathize, for our hearts to show pity, to be brought to a new life because of that love. Unlike in Aeschylus, there is no indication that Orestes kills Clytemnestra and Odysseus out of fidelity to the gods. Instead, Orestes is an oracle of reckoning and an angel, a spirit of deliverance. The real story is not revenge or justice. It is Electra's liberation, her salvation, if you will, from the tyranny under which she suffers. This, according to Sophocles, takes love, and the love of the family in particular, the very themes that were the focus of Oedipus Rex and Antigone. Without love and without the family, life is unbearable. With the arrival of Orestes, love and the reconstitution of a family bring deliverance and end the tyranny of the state. One can only hope that life with others, with a family, with friends, is that which also awaits Philoctetes as he leaves his Robinson Crusoe-like state of existence behind him. If Aeschylus saw strife and love being superseded by persuasion and justice through the ancient divinities, and if Euripides, as we will see, exposed the hollowness of those divinities that Aeschylus piously venerated, Sophocles offers to us, in this intermediary stage, the playwright's life between Aeschylus and Euripides, the modus vivendi between the two. And it is for that reason that I think Sophocles is often held up as second greatest, only behind that of Aeschylus. After all, Aristophanes pits Aeschylus and Euripides against each other in the Frogs. But in that play, Aeschylus favors Sophocles, as is heir apparent. Though there are differences between Aeschylus and Sophocles, they are also closely interlinked with each other. Sophocles is continuing to develop through his plays the thought found in the plays of Aeschylus. While Aeschylus offers a vision of laboring with gods for a better world of reason and justice, And while Euripides seems to suggest that man alone is in control of his fate and actions, Sophocles humanizes the hopeful vision of Aeschylus. The gods are never central characters in Sophocles' surviving dramas in the way they were in Aeschylus. The gods are in many ways conspicuously absent, again, at least in the plays that have survived for posterity. Instead, we see love and deliverance between humans. The gods remain at a distance. Sophocles, then, was a traditionalist and a humanist. Sophocles understood the place of love and the family as the cornerstone of civilization and the good life, thus standing in stark contrast to the dangerous love of Euripides. The dissipation of the family had led to the forgetting of those ancient codes and ways of life that make civic life possible and fruitful. When the family dies or disintegrates, state tyranny emerges to take its place. Yet Sophocles' advocacy rests on filial piety instead of divine piety. It is the love that we show to our family members rather than the devotion to the gods that leads to our deliverance. Moreover, and more scandalously, if not otherwise darkly, redemption in Sophocles is born only in and through tragedy. Without tragedy, there can be no redemption, for redemption can only happen in a world of tragedy, where the tragic governs reality. We must plunge into the abyss of death and tyranny before being lifted out of the darkness. The light in Sophocles is surrounded by a cesspool of blood, corruption, and murder. This is what we witness in his plays: blood, corruption, and murder. Indeed, the light flows out of that drowning darkness of gore, revenge, and sorrow. At the end, in Electra, we see the humane epitome of what Sophocles is trying to underscore. When we kill our parents, when we laugh at their misery, when we deny our brothers and sisters, when we mock our family members, we are living in a very dangerous world. But in that darkness of gore, revenge, and sorrow emerges the possibility of light, the light of love, the love found in family. Sophocles was not sacrilegious or irreligious. He honored the gods like a good Athenian. Yet he didn't seem to think, as Aeschylus thought, that the gods are integral players in human development and deliverance, hence the humanism of Sophocles. That is what he left to us, the importance of human love in the life we live in society. In some respects, a world where we are responsible for moral action and loving deliverance is just as daunting and haunting a prospect as standing before the court of Athena and Apollo in trial and being melded to a co-laborer with the divine reality of reason and justice. The light is brightest when it is surrounded by the darkest cloud trying to suffocate it. And the light of Sophocles shines ever so brightly in that darkness ensnaring it. To journey and stand at the top of Mount Parnassus is a gritty and grisly struggle. Despite the darkness surrounding us in this journey, Sophocles guides us up the mountain with a dim light, only to reveal a grander light at the peak, and that light is the love of family. Moving on to Euripides, the dramatist and playwright who we've already referenced many times in this lecture, we meet the breakdown of the Aeschylean and Sophoclean vision of the cosmos. If we recall, as we've just been covering, Aeschylus and Sophocles are building on one another. Again, you have that famous saying of the Furies, cry, cry in triumph, carry on the dancing on and on. This peace between Athena's people and their guests must never end. All seeing Zeus and fate embrace, down they come to urge our union on. Cry, cry in triumph, carry on the dancing on and on. That is how Aeschylus ended his Oresteia trilogy. The Furies, which had so hounded and haunted Orestes, had transformed into co-laborers with the gods, with Athena, singing and dancing for the joy of rationality and civilization. Euripides, the great cynic and blasphemer, took a darker and starker approach to the gods and of Greek civilization. Perhaps one of the reasons why he was in fact less successful than his predecessors in being awarded at festivals and competitions for his writings. Yet, Euripides' cynicism and blasphemy is very important for us to understand as we see the progression, the evolution, and one might say the devolution of Greek drama. The Bacchae is a classic cornerstone of Western literature. It is arguably the most famous of Euripides' plays. It is the one play of his that is part of the undisputed classical canon. If there is one play of Euripides that people read or are at least still familiar with, nearly 2,500 years later, it is the Bacchae. Euripides wrote in an anxious and transformative age, just as Sophocles did. The Persians had just been defeated, and Athens, Athena, had ascended as the premier power among the Greeks. Euripides was but a young man when Athens ascended to her infamous glory that still mesmerizes and haunts our own civilization in the 21st century. The Athenian Empire, as recounted by Thucydides in his History of the Peloponnesian War, was exceptional because it was not the product of conquest, but of mutual defense. No other empire, the Athenian delegates argue, had ever been formed in such a manner. But the later plays of Euripides, including his Bacchae, are set in dire and dark times. Athens's grand Sicilian conquest had failed. The Peloponnesian War had turned against Athens. The city was suffering from civil war, sexual depravity, and the general disintegration of its society. Euripides might be reaching back to ancient and mythological figures, but their tales and fates are eerily similar to the Athens at the time and the end of the 5th century, on the eve of Euripides' own death. The darkness of Euripides' tragedies coincides with the nadir of Athenian grandeur. The sun is setting over the great Athenian Empire. It is well known that many of his plays, composed during the Peloponnesian War, like the Trojan Women, are veiled commentaries on the state of Athenian society and the war itself. The Athens celebrated by Athena and the transformed Furies at the end of Aeschylus' Humanides, and the Athens eulogized by Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, is not the Athens that Euripides composed his late plays to reflect. The Bacchae, among the last plays of Euripides, was composed in a tumultuous city filled with strife and conflict. Though the play is set in Thebes, the tragedy that befalls Pentheus is an esoteric commentary, a veiled commentary, an indirect commentary on the state of Athenian society and the insufficiency of the gods of the city. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, of reason and persuasion, alongside being a strong goddess of war, is no longer being upheld as the champion, as the epitome of what Athenian civilization should be pursuing. But her wisdom and justice are, of course, what define her and what defined the grandeur of Athenian civilization, or at least the Athenian apologists like to claim. And that her name is borne by Athens. Athens is supposed to be the wise and just city, in a mere reflection of its patron deity, which exonerated Orestes and transformed the Furies. But of course, Euripides is saying that this is not the city of Athens, if it ever was to begin with. Something wicked comes to Greece. This is the reality of the situation when the Bacchae opens. Dionysus travels from the eastern lands. Dionysus, though nominally a Greek god, is presented by Euripides as if a foreign oriental sex god and a conqueror of Greece. Moreover, the power of Dionysus is immediately made known to the crowd or reader. I come from Lydia, its territories teeming with gold, and from rich Phrygia. I am all conqueror in the sun-beaten steppes of Persia, the walled cities of Bactria, the wintry lands of Media, and in Arabia Felix, land of the blessed. All Asia is mine, and along the fringes of the sea, the pinnacled glory of all those mingled cities of Greeks and many races. Everywhere Dionysus goes, notice that he conquers. No land, whether south, east, north, or now west, can escape the consuming madness of Dionysus, Bacchus, and the Bacchantes. We may have now forgotten, but it certainly wasn't lost on 5th century Athenians, that dancing is an intrinsically sexual act. Dancing is the great rite, the great ritual that Dionysus brings with him. As Dionysus himself proclaims, elsewhere, everywhere, I have established my sacraments and dances to make my godhead manifest to mortals. Elsewhere, he also sings, for sacred dances and joy, in the mountains the wild delight of Bacchus in his soul. His rituals he undergoes, Cybele's orgies, great mothers, he shakes the Thyris on high. The women of Thebes are entranced, as if becoming sex slaves, by this new god and his rituals. They lose their clothes and their minds, dancing and howling wildly on the mountain at night. The social order of the city is so threatened that Pentheus orders Dionysus arrested, and his men prepared for battle to put an end to this threat that has come to the city. Pentheus, as the king of Thebes, has a duty to protect his citizens and the social fabric and order of his civilization, which he correctly perceives to be threatened by the arrival of Dionysus. It is now well accepted that Euripides did not have a change of heart late in his life. Euripides had always been critical of the gods. He was, at the eve of his death, still critical of the gods. Modern degenerates may be sympathetic to Dionysus, but Dionysus is hardly presented in any sympathetic light by Euripides. Euripides sees little good in Dionysus after he viciously and brutally turns on Pentheus, intoxicating the king who giggles like a girl and dresses like a woman to get a better view of the naked women of the city in their entranced ritual dancing and moaning. Pentheus, however, is not without some fault. But as the play reaches its climax, we grieve for Pentheus, his mother, and his grandfather, but hardly shed a tear for Dionysus. In fact, we turn on Dionysus and wish to tear him limb from limb, just as the Titans had done to him. The contemporary reading of fun-loving Dionysus against power-imposing Pentheus misses the obvious and more contextual reality of the play. Both Dionysus and Pentheus are engaged in an exercise of power and will, and not freedom versus tyranny, as post-World War II readings of the text now erroneously and terribly assert. Pentheus may have acted with impiety toward this foreign oriental sex god, but Pentheus certainly had the foresight, as the play reveals, by his grisly dismemberment at the hands of the women of the city, including his own mother, and the threat Dionysus posed. In Pentheus challenging Dionysus, the king is not challenging the free-loving and free-playing Dionysus, but challenging Dionysus's own lust for control and power and conquest. After all, when Dionysus is introduced, he proclaims his power of conquest and that all the world, except for Greece, but now Greece included, has been brought under his dominion. And where is the free-loving and free-playing spirit of dancing of those enraptured by Dionysus? Bacchus and the Bacchans are terrible people. They commit murder in their rapturous enchantment. The contest between Pentheus and Dionysus is one of power. Pentheus understands the arrival of this foreign sex-crazed god as a threat to his power, but also the power and social order of the city of Thebes. Dionysus, in seeing Pentheus's seriousness in gathering his armies for battle and clearing out the mountains, and his plan to clear out the mountains of the Bacchans, understands that his power is being threatened by Pentheus. Sacrilege and impiety are mere pretexts to kill the king, which is precisely what Dionysus concludes must happen for his power, not his free-loving and free-playing spirit, to survive. Irrespective of the reception and development of Dionysus in the subsequent tradition, the Dionysus of Euripides is a cold, lustful, and power-hungry dark god of vindictive cruelty. Dionysus is a god of dark fear and manipulation. His dark presence fills Pentheus with fear, and when Pentheus challenges Dionysus' arrival, he manipulates the king to be torn limb from limb by his induced dancers. Euripides' gods are not the gods of Aeschylus, though they bear the same name. No, Euripides' gods are the gods of Hesiod, given a new, cunning, and manipulative makeover. Furthermore, they are depicted as clear threats to the human social order. At least, Hesiod's gods fought among themselves and castrated the bodies and organs of fellow immortal gods, instead of ripping humans limb from limb, with their entrails spilling out into the laps of fanatically enraptured servants. That is how the Bacchae ends. That is what happens to Pentheus. He is ripped limb from limb, with his entrails spilling out into the laps of those who murdered him, including his own mother. It seems to me that Euripides is a great and scandalous humanist, a cynical one at that, as well as being morally astute and insightful to the problems concerning human relationships. Aeschylus's human progress is still controlled by the gods, as indicated by Athena's role at the end of the Eumenides. We labor with the gods and appeal to the gods in Aeschylus, but the gods do in fact have the final say. Euripides' human progress, if there is progress in his tragedies, is not in the hands of the gods, but left in the hands of humans. Pentheus is brutally torn apart by the women of Thebes who, once freed from Dionysus' licentious spell, realize the depravity of their action and mourn for Pentheus. Euripides, through Agave and the chorus, remind us of the brutality and the harshness of the world, especially the classical pantheon, whose gods raped, murdered, and controlled others at whim. Dionysus, in standing over the dismembered body of Pentheus and observing the tragic scene of a man's mother holding her son's head as if a lion's head, defends himself by asserting that Pentheus's impiety justified his death. The sins of jealousy and anger made this Pentheus deal unjustly with one bringing blessings, whom he disgracefully imprisoned and assaulted. But what blessings did Dionysus actually bring? Slavery and insanity are what Dionysus brought. Indeed, Cadmus falls to his knees in slavery to Dionysus, crying out, "Have mercy, Dionysus, for we have sinned." But who brought forth the sin of filicide and murder? Dionysus, not Pentheus or Agave. Agave's final words are, "Let others meddle with the Bacchants." She realizes the problem that Dionysus brings. In tearing her son apart in a crazed stupor, Agave apparently has had enough of being a Bacchant dancer and has returned to her senses and wants nothing to do with the god who caused her to tear her son apart like a crazed beast. It is the human characters who have and manifest moral realization in the play, not Dionysus. Cadmus awakens Agave and the women from their intoxication to see the horror and the suffering that they have wrought to poor Pentheus, as well as to themselves. Agave and the women take responsibility for their actions and weep for the king. In mournful exodus, it is the humanity of the Thebans freed from Dionysus which touches us most in this bleak, dark tragedy that the great poet W.B. Yeats recalled as if peering into the hollow sacristy to see the secretive and horrifying sacrament of a bloodthirsty god made flesh to feast, and the flesh of his victims. During now the introduction to the Trojan women, Euripides also presents Athena and Poseidon as conniving and jealous gods like Bacchus, making a pact to make the return journey of the Greeks miserable as possible, despite their victory in the Trojan War. Though composed 25 years earlier than the Bacchae, Euripides' Medea deals with this same theme of gods and humans battling for the control and destiny of the world, as well as our soulful and heart's dispositions. And so we can see, when we know the chronology of Euripides' plays, he does not have a change of heart, as some very poor scholars have tried to say. He was critical of the gods when he was young. He is critical of the gods in his old age. Medea has been slighted by Jason, and her life and social standing has all been swept out from under her feet. Her brutal murder of her own sons is unforgivable, but Jason is also equally not without any guilt. The gods are absent in the play, but not without being invoked, and in their invocations we see Euripides' criticism and cynicism of the gods. The rage of Medea brings death and destruction. The infidelity of Jason brings rage leading to death and destruction. In the second choral ode, Euripides tells us something scandalously shocking, at least in comparison to where Greek literature had been progressing up to his moment in time. Love is a dangerous thing, loving without any limit, discredit and loss it can bring. Love has entered the consciousness and the vocabulary of the Greek literary philosophical tradition, in large part, as mentioned already in this lecture, because of Homer and Aeschylus, and also its continued humanistic development in Sophocles. However, love in Euripides is scorned, shown to be hollow, and ultimately, as he says, something dangerous. Euripides' plays show us the hollowness and vanity, indeed the cruelty of the gods. Athena has been dethroned, and the empty gods who demand child sacrifices and capture entire cities and make them servile slaves has returned. Humans have once again been deprived of light and made into the toiling servants of the gods. whose cruel fates and sadistic impulses can visit us at any time. Moreover, love is also deconstructed throughout Euripides' plays. The emphasis placed on love, as was the case with Medea, only came back to haunt her. Indeed, love made her a slave and did not bring her salvation, but cheaply disposed of her when socially and politically relevant. This too is true in the Trojan women, where the love exhibited by Hecuba and Andromache for a now burnt Troy and their slain husbands only add to their misery. Are the gods worthy of veneration? In answering this question, we must ask, which gods? The Greek gods went through many faces, though they bore the same names. The gods born from Hesiod's pen were cruel and lustful gods who engaged in patricide and usurpation. The gods of Homer are equally mischievous, though Homer humanizes Eros, love, and gives us great hope as he shifts our concentration away from the gods and to fated human beings. The gods of Aeschylus are just and persuasive, rational and loving, gods we can relate with and ultimately become co-laborers with. Aeschylus provides the synthesis of the hateful gods of Hesiod and the fatalistic but humanistic love of Homer. The gods of Euripides are brutal, ruthless, and full of cruel surprises, the exact opposite of Aeschylus's gods and the beautiful and sumptuous fleshy gods of the Catholic Renaissance painters. The gods of Euripides are bloodthirsty and call for virgin sacrifices to procure blessing in war. Nevertheless, Euripides remains a moralist, a cynical humanist, but he was not locating the heart of morality in the gods, the cosmos, or even other humans. Euripides located the heart of morality in ourselves, as individuals freed from the bonds of the gods and, yes, even from the bonds of other people. For it is the love of another that makes love dangerous in Euripides' plays. If we do find equally moral people who can love and can flourish, as Andromache did with Hector, that is no guarantee of the good life either. Just look at what happened to Andromache after Hector's death and the sack of Troy and the agonizing pain that she subsequently suffered. Instead, the love and the progress that we must find is located in ourselves. It is the parents of Pentheus who recognize the errors of their way, and they individually come to a repentance and a sorrow and a pity. Euripides is trying to teach us in his plays that we must awaken the moral heart in ourselves before we can take mercy and pity upon others. We are the arbiters. We are the actors of the love that can bring about a minimalistic, perhaps, redemption and sanctification in the world. It is purely up to us as individuals to recognize the importance of having pity and mercy and recognizing the errors of our ways. In this respect, Euripides was the first and most dramatic libertarian in Western history. We must look after ourselves and take responsibility for our actions. In accepting responsibility for ourselves and our actions, we can then have a social order worthy of being venerated and protected, not by the gods, but by ourselves, by our own recognition of what needs to be done. The ultimate message of Euripides is the same message that Aristophanes has him speak in The Frogs. Be weary of trusting others for your salvation. Look to yourselves. That message has reverberated through history ever since Euripides put it to dramatic form. As we conclude this lecture, having examined the origin, the meaning, and the evolution of the Greek dramatic tradition, it is important that we end by briefly talking about Aristophanes. That Aristophanes is one of the few poets who is actually named and included in Plato's dialogues reveals the respect Plato had for Athens' great poetic satirist. Aristophanes is the last of the principal Greek playwrights. In fact, many people might not actually read Aristophanes in the course of a introductory education into Greek literature. You principally are going to read Homer, and you're going to read Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. And why is this? It's because Aristophanes is a satirist. We have moved from the hopeful progression of Aeschylus, the in-between medium of a little bit of cynicism, but also the prospect of hopeful, loving deliverance in Sophocles, to the cynicism of Euripides. Satire seems to emerge in a literary and intellectual context when its intellectual tradition, what it had been working toward, finally dies. And it died with Euripides as we exhausted ourselves into the pit of cynicism. It is no longer the cosmos, it is no longer the gods, and it is quite frankly not even possible to love others to bring about this world of justice and rationality. Euripides argues that we must turn back and look into ourselves. We must trust ourselves and start from there all over again. It is the end. He represents the end of the intellectual progression, the wrestling with the Greek pathological cosmos that dominates the dramatic tradition. And so, as this tradition dies, satire emerges because it has nothing else to offer. Aristophanes satirizes everything. He satirizes the gods. He satirizes Athenian society. He satirizes what it means to be a male or a female. He satirizes war. He satirizes the entire political system. And yet, it is Aristophanes, the great satirist, who Plato includes in his various dialogues, especially the Symposium. As I've written in an article dealing with Plato and the Symposium, Plato, through Socrates, is decidedly on the side of the poets. He is not only engaged in a remythology against the demythologizers, but he also draws on the two partial truths revealed by the mad Aristophanes and the eloquent Agathon, synthesizing the two together in Socrates and that most remarkable dialogue and vision which has reverberated through the millennia, and that is the vision of Diadema. Prior to the rise of the post-Socratic tradition of philosophy, the true wellspring, as we've been discussing, of Greek intellectual thought was not in the philosophical sophists or even the pre-Socratics, but in the poets, in the dramatists, in the playwrights. However, as this intellectual tradition dies and exhausts itself and ends in the satire of Aristophanes, the suppression of poetry by philosophy reveals the eventual insufficiency of poetry in continuing to be able to wrestle with the crises that beset Greek civilization in the 5th and 4th centuries. Greek literature, the playwright tradition, dealt with what Vico called sublime or poetic metaphysics. More specifically, the course of Greek literature deals with pathology, it deals with passion. We see the pathological cosmos that exists in the Greek literary tradition, and that is eventually moved from the gods to fate to humans. from Hesiod and Homer down through the playwrights, we see the cosmos moved by emotion and passion. Emotion and passion, which is also included in the satires of Aristophanes. While some of the pre-Socratic philosophers challenged this view, it wasn't until the rise of Plato that the insufficiency of the pathological cosmos, dealt with by the playwrights and the dramatists, was superseded by the rational cosmos. And yet, in an odd way, this is taking us back. It is taking us back to Aeschylus, who was asserting at the end of the Oresteia that the world, the cosmos, the gods, human desire and civilization has a rational underpinning to it. What we find in the evolution of Greek drama is ultimately the breakdown of the cosmos of rationality, justice, love, and morality. By the time we reach Aristophanes, he again satirizes the entire cosmic intellectual tradition contained within the playwright dramatic tradition. We return to the dark and violent cosmos of Hesiod, as Euripides so brilliantly shows us, as we move into the end, the nadir of Greek drama. As we know from what develops after the Greek dramatic tradition, specifically with the development of Socratic philosophy, this reality proves untenable, and thus it is the failure of drama, it is the failure of the Greek playwright tradition to provide us a sufficient resolution to the problem of passion and rationality, the meaning and destiny of human life in the cosmos, that gives birth to philosophy. The end of cosmic drama as a means for the intellectual life paved the way for the birth of philosophy, out of the failure of drama to provide the answers to life's enduring and meaningful questions. And the rest, as the saying goes, is history.